Welcome to the deep dive. We've got a really interesting set of notes and predictions here today.
Yeah, definitely some bold claims in there.
Absolutely. And we're going to try and break down the essential takeaways, looking at, the future of U.S.-China economic ties, potential global power shifts,
Hmm.
all based on this source material.
Exactly. Our mission basically is to distill the core arguments and figure out what the potential implications might be.
Okay, so right off the bat, what's the central idea here?
Well, the author seems absolutely convinced that we're going to see the U.S. ramp up tariffs on China, like, very soon.
Okay, more trade pressure.
But it's more than that. They argue China isn't just going to, take it. They apparently have a strategy not just to survive this pressure, but to
Oh,
actually use it to undermine the U.S. and its whole global economic leadership position.
that's quite a claim.
Yeah.
And didn't the author also make a prediction about Trump?
Oh, yeah. Super bold. They suggested that even if Trump were to win office again, this new economic approach from China would mean his presidency wouldn't last past January 2026.
Wow. Okay, let's definitely dig into that. So, starting with these tariffs, the author sees this as a high probability event, calls it the final crazy crackdown. Why so certain?
Well, the thinking seems to be it's the next logical step in the current tensions, maybe a sort of last-ditch effort from the U.S. side, fueled by anxiety about China's rise.
Right.
But the really interesting part is China's planned reaction. The author claims that the moment the U.S. raises interest rates, China will just, bam, cancel its export tax rebates.
Hang on. Export tax rebates. Those are the refunds China gives its own companies to make their stuff cheaper abroad, right?
Exactly.
So canceling them makes Chinese goods more expensive. How does that help them withstand U.S. pressure? Seems backward.
I know, it sounds counterintuitive. The author does acknowledge there could be some short-term pain for China, but they really emphasize that China is supposedly prepared for this
Prepared how?
through, and I quote, significant financial reserves. The idea is they can absorb the hit, plus there's this massive financial bazooka they apparently plan to fire. The People's Bank of China, the PBOC, injecting something like 6 trillion RMB directly into commercial banks.
The Strolian.
Yeah. And the author projects this could have a huge leverage effect, potentially unleashing, get this, 150 trillion RMB into the market overall.
Wait, leverage effect, meaning that initial 6 trillion fuels way more lending and activity.
Precisely. So if you connect the dots, this huge cash injection would, boost their domestic economy, creating internal demand to offset weaker exports.
And maybe fund this whole new model of theirs.
Exactly. It seems designed to power that shift. But I mean, you do have to wonder about the risks, right? Pumping that much money in, inflation, other potential side effects.
Yeah, definitely a question mark there. Which brings us nicely to this new model you mentioned. What is it? The author seems to think it's a game changer.
It really seems to be the core of their argument. The idea is China's moving away from the old B2B business-to-business trade with American companies.
So not selling to Walmart or Apple as much.
Less of that and more focusing on selling directly to American consumers, using these, super fast 5G e-commerce platforms to think TMU or the overseas versions of Taobao.
Ah, okay. Like cutting out the middleman.
Exactly. The author sees it as a fundamental challenge to what they call the 400-year Western global trade model. Their big critique is that model is dominated by brands and channels.
The intermediaries.
Right, like Nike or Starbucks. They enter these brands at massive markups that have little to do with the actual production cost. They give some pretty stark examples.
I remember seeing those. The shoes, right, costing
Oh.
what, 70 RMB at the factory?
Sells for maybe 80 RMB to the next guy.
And then suddenly it's 800 or even 1600 RMB for the consumer just because it has the Nike swoosh on it.
Exactly. And the coffee example, too. Like 2.5 RMB factory costs ballooning to 28 RMB or more by the time Starbucks serves it. The author clearly thinks this is wildly inefficient.
Yeah, you can see the argument. The value is in the brand and distribution, not the coffee beans.
So the author asserts China plans to just wash out, as they put it, this entire traditional supply chain, leverage their huge manufacturing base and their, frankly, quite advanced internet marketing skills.
To sell directly through platforms like Paymo, Shumatong, TikTok.
Precisely. Bypassing the American businesses and, crucially, bypassing the tariffs that hit those business-to-business transactions.
Ah, okay. So if the tariff applies when a Chinese company sells to a U.S. company, but they're selling straight to Mrs. Smith in Ohio.
Then yeah, it leads to the author's really provocative question. Can the U.S. government actually track and effectively tax millions upon millions of individual Americans making these direct, often small value purchases from China?
Hmm. Logistically, that sounds like an absolute nightmare. Politically, too, probably. Taxing your own citizens for buying cheap stuff online?
It's a huge challenge, and this whole shift in trade mechanics feeds directly into the author's view on, the bigger picture global power shifting.
Right, they bring up China's manufacturing output. What was the figure?
A massive 35% of the global total. And they make a point of saying that's more than the US, Japan, Germany, UK, and France combined, which is,
Yeah, that's a powerful number. Puts things in perspective.
it really underscores the author's belief in China's fundamental economic weight. And they build on that, claiming China's internet technology is now globally leading.
Is that where Team U comes in again?
Yep. They cite TMU as the #1 platform in the US for growth in downloads, user numbers, transaction growth, apparently surpassing Amazon on those metrics.
Surpassing Amazon. Wow. Still, you have to wonder, is that sustainable growth? Or is it just capturing the bargain basement hunters? Will people stick with it long term over, say, Amazon Prime's convenience?
That's the key question, isn't it? Is it a fundamental shift or just market segmentation? And this confidence, this belief in China's own strength seems to shape their view on alliances too.
Yeah, the author says strong nations don't need them, using some historical analogies.
Right, the Eastern Six Kingdoms needing to ally against the powerful Qin state back in ancient China. The implication being China is now like Qin, strong enough to go it alone.
And they predict a divided Europe and a divided U.S.
Euro divided and America divided, yeah. It's a very self-reliant, almost isolationist view of power, quite different from the Western focus on alliances.
Definitely. Now, the author doesn't hold back on criticizing U.S. leadership either. They admire certain historical Chinese figures.
Oh, absolutely. High praise for figures like Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, for unifying China, standardizing things.
Yeah.
They see that as strong, decisive leadership.
And they contrast that with?
With their view of the Trump era, which they see as trying to recapture some kind of past glory that, in their opinion, just isn't coming back. They were also critical of Trump's cabinet picks.
Calling them abnormal.
Yeah.
What do they mean by that?
Well, they don't spell it out precisely, but the vibe is, maybe lacking the usual qualifications or experience, or maybe just being unconventional appointments for those big roles: trade, education, defense, etc.
Okay.
And this skepticism extends to ideas about reforming the U.S. government, too. They seem particularly worried about big cuts to the civil service.
Is that where the other historical analogy came in? The Ming Dynasty one?
Yeah, that was a really striking one. They compared potential large-scale cuts to the U.S. civil service to the Tongzhen Emperor cutting his civil service back in the 1600s.
And the author argues that helped lead to the dynasty's collapse.
They argue it contributed to the rise of the rebel leader Li Zicheng and the Ming Dynasty's downfall. The author then asks, what happens to, say, 80% of laid-off U.S. government workers if the industrial base is weak and labor costs are high? It's a pretty grim scenario they paint.
It is. Though, you always have to question how directly you can apply lessons from 17th century China to the modern U.S., right?
Absolutely. Historical parallels are useful thought experiments, but yeah, rarely a perfect fit. The author also makes some very specific and, frankly, quite bold claims about technology, specifically semiconductors.
Right, the chips. What were they saying?
They assert China already holds over 50% of the market for 7-nanometer chips, which are pretty advanced and is aggressively grabbing share in the 14-millimeter and 28-millimeter segments, too.
Okay.
And then there's this claim about SMIC, the big Chinese chip maker. Apparently, they plan to start selling 28-millimeter lithography machines, the super complex machines needed to make chips globally at half the price of current suppliers.
Half price for lithography machines. That would be huge.
And slash overall chip prices by 40%. If that's accurate, it would completely reshape the global semiconductor industry. Massive pressure on existing players in Taiwan, South Korea, the US, Europe.
It would accelerate China's self-sufficiency drive massively, too.
Totally. Which leads the author to ask this rather pointed rhetorical question. If the West loses its lead in mobile phones, high-speed rail, nuclear power, aviation, and semiconductors, what's actually left?
Oof. Yeah, that paints a picture of a potentially rapid shift in who leads technologically.
It really does.
Okay, so let's pivot slightly to China's broader global strategy and this idea about the decline of the U.S. dollar. First, the author mentions China sort of lacks friends. Why do they think that is?
Interestingly, their argument isn't really about bad diplomacy or anything. It's more an economic consequence. They suggest China's industrial power has become so broad and dominant that it ends up disrupting the economies of countries that might have been allies.
How so?
They give examples like Japan's electronics and car industries, or South Korea's shipbuilding and semiconductors, all facing really intense competition from China now. So instead of complementing each other economically, they're often direct rivals. It's a view that economic competition can override other factors.
An interesting perspective.
Hmm.
That dominance itself breeds isolation in a way.
Kind of. And then they predict China's about to have major breakthroughs in high-tech electricity generation, new energy, high-speed rail again, but also in culture. And they project these sectors will, quote, conquer the world.
Conquer the world. That's ambitious. And the timeline they put on all this seems very fast, right? Weakening the U.S. financial system and shattering the dollar by 2025.
Yeah, the darkest hour for Chinese entrepreneurs ending in 2025, followed by this rapid move against the U.S. financial system and the dollar. It's extremely specific and, frankly, sounds incredibly aggressive.
How do they think China would even achieve that? What's the mechanism?
Well, the strategy outlined is a bit complex. It involves apparently using the Chinese real estate market almost like a strategic tool, maybe letting some instability happen there,
Why?
to, according to the author, try and trick the U.S. into hiking interest rates even further. The goal, supposedly, is to push the U.S. economy towards a breaking point through higher inflation.
Okay, that sounds like playing with fire.
It does. And they have this really unusual phrase. They claim China is currently exporting anti-inflation to the U.S.
Exporting anti-inflation, what does that even mean? Like deflation.
It's abstract, isn't it? My best guess is they mean the flood of cheap Chinese goods is actually helping to keep U.S. inflation lower than it otherwise would be.
Okay. Like cheap stuff from Temu and Shein keeps overall prices down.
Plausibly, yeah. And the author calls this anti-inflation more potent than a nuclear weapon, a potential fatal blow given the U.S. inflation numbers they were citing.
Wow. So the argument is the U.S. is so focused on China as a rival, it's missing how China's actions are fundamentally changing the game. And the U.S. can't really reverse course now.
That seems to be the gist. And they lay out China's own strategy very clearly. The left hand is the Belt and Road Initiative, building infrastructure globally.
And the right hand.
The digital RMB, their central bank digital currency, and pushing carbon neutrality standards, both seen as ways to set future global economic and tech rules directly challenging the current U.S.-led system.
And they see signs the dollar's grip is already slipping.
Yeah, the author points to several things. Brazil agreeing to free exchange between the real and the RMB, cutting out the dollar. Malaysia talking about an Asian yuan currency system.
Right.
And significantly, more oil trades happening in RMB, even with Middle Eastern countries like Iran, Saudi Arabia, even apparently Israel using the Shanghai Petroleum RMB exchange. These are definitely signals of a diversification away from the dollar, even if its dominance is still huge overall.
So quite a few indicators they point to.
Yeah.
And the author wraps up by saying, the next 20 years will be even more transformative than the last 40 of China's opening up.
That's the final note. A period of massive change, urging businesses to shift focus heavily towards high-end stuff. AI, new materials, new energy, biotech. Basically the industries of the future where they see China competing or maybe even leading.
Okay, so if we try to boil this all down, the core prediction is imminent U.S. tariff hikes, met by a Chinese strategy to bypass them with direct-to-consumer sales, leading to a projected decline in U.S. economic power and the dollar's role, while China rises fast in manufacturing and key technologies. Is that about right?
That sums up the author's main narrative arc pretty well, yeah. It's a comprehensive vision and, like we said, definitely provocative and paints a picture of potentially huge shifts on the horizon. It hangs together as a theory, whether you buy all the specifics or not.
Absolutely. It's a lot to take in, a vision of a dramatically reshaped global economic order. So, thinking about everything we've just discussed, all these bold predictions, what single aspect of this potential future strikes you as most compelling or perhaps most concerning? And what other questions does it raise for you about where the global economy might actually be heading? That's something to ponder as we wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for tuning in.